Well, let me turn on my own. I wanted to thank everyone for coming today to our coffee chat. This is our 6th one of the year. And I wanted to introduce our speaker today, Lauren Lurkins, and I'm going to let her introduce herself. So thank you for agreeing to talk today. And I'm really excited to hear your presentation.
Well, thank you. I'm in my basement of home. And so I've threatened the small people above me that they need to get off the internet because everything we do in our house these days is connected online. So that can be a problem, but thanks for having me. My name is Lauren Lurkins, and I've had some career changes since I was invited to speak to you. So that's why Jill's like, why don't you just tell them what you're working on? But I'll kind of talk about my background, and then I'm here to talk about carbon markets. And I kind of put that in context of policy decisions and discussions. But my background is I grew up in Marion, Illinois, down in the southern part of the state. My dad and his dad were prison guards. And so I did not obviously want to follow in their footsteps, but I went to St. Louis University, majored in environmental science, and then went to law school down at Carbondale. Out of law school, I spent 7 years at a private law firm in Springfield, representing a variety of industries, including agricultural co-ops and mainly livestock farmers as they navigated EPA enforcement issues and compliance. And then the last 10 years, I've actually spent at Illinois Farm Bureau working in their governmental affairs on environmental, regulatory, legislative issues at the federal and the state level. I interacted with Gail quite a bit because I tapped on her as my expert on quite a few different things. And I love her, as I'm sure all of you do. But we partnered up on quite a few things, particularly within the USDA NRCS world because of her knowledge there. But we overlapped on manure, as you heard if you joined a little bit earlier. But about a month ago, I transitioned to my own consulting firm, Lurkins Strategies, LLC. And I'm going to be working in this space in 3 different areas. The first is that policy and regulatory support for trade associations, businesses and individuals on environmental and conservation issues. So I was just talking about some of the clients that I've got at the federal level, a lot of livestock groups still trying to navigate the old and new environmental issues, and then a lot focused still on some overlap on nutrients and water quality, and then a couple other things that I'm waiting. So that's the first part. The second is academic support. I've got a lot of friends within the university system, including the University of Illinois, that they need help connecting with real life farmers and stakeholders and funding sources. And so I'm hoping to be able to help them and continue that role. And then the third is an area that I'm very interested in. I think this actually ties in a little bit to the climate world, and that is corporate and investor consulting with regard to sustainability. There is a massive amount of venture capital funding that is all interested in Midwestern agriculture, ag tech, and it is cool. And I'd say about 90% or more of the interest is all in that world of sustainability. How do we, build on the tech tools that are out there on the farm and help farmers do more with regard to climate, to soil health, to water quality, and even quantity if you're looking at sort of irrigation. So I'm hoping to kind of play a little bit in that role. I've got some opportunities, and I just think it's fascinating, the amount of money and interest that is there in agriculture. And it could go really good, really well, or it could, be misguided. And so I'm just hoping to maybe bring a little bit of common sense and practicality into those conversations. So that's my newest endeavor, and I'm really excited about it. So I am a registered lobbyist at the federal and state level. I still do have that environmental, my legal license in Illinois, although I don't want to go back to like a real law firm. I have more fun working for farmers and working in this space, but I would if I had to, I guess. So I want to talk a little bit today about climate and where carbon markets fit. And this is a conversation that frankly could go on for an hour. So it's going to be a little bit condensed, but there is more to talk about. But I just kind of want to start with some background information on ag emissions data in general. the spiel that's out there a lot is the EPA emissions inventory. And it says that agriculture across our country is responsible for about 10% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So other sectors are energy or transportation. And so we do know that agriculture can play a role. But we also have a very good track record within all sectors of agriculture of basically doing more with less throughout the last, couple decades, 30 years, 40 years. So total GHG emissions are down about 10.7% back in 2020, with the ag emissions being down about 4.3%. And we know, as I just said, that we're more productive using the resources that we have, and our productivity in agriculture, we are gaining in our productivity, not by growth, but really in just doing more with less. And animal agriculture gets a little bit of a focus in all of these conversations. And truly, animal agriculture's role in GHG emissions is actually less than 3% of the entire thing. So it can be that shiny, sexy thing that activists like to point to, but really it's fairly small. And I think there's very good data to point to for how far our livestock industries have gone. And since 1990, when you look at the emissions per unit of beef, they're down 8%, of unit of pork down 19%, and units of milk down 26%. So I feel like as agriculture, for a lot of reasons, we have a great track record to point to. And then, I wanted to talk, before I start talking about the nitty gritty of carbon markets and how in my 10 years at Farm Bureau, and really about 3 working on this particular issue, how farmers are feeling about it anecdotally. I want to kind of paint that picture on the federal side, because truly since the campaign, the presidential campaign, and through the Biden administration, there have been multiple attempts and some massive successes in this. But, when you look at the way that, I guess I have some opening thoughts on just the issue and how agriculture is being portrayed. Obviously there are haters, and there will always be those activists that their ultimate goal is to change and or diminish the ag industry. But for the most part, I think the prevailing sentiment is thinking about agriculture as a solution here for climate change. And that's very positive. But you've got a lot of interest. I talked before about venture capital. You've got not just government involvement at the federal level and the state level, if you're here in Illinois, like we all are, but you've got sort of society in general being concerned about the future of the environment and climate. And you've got world leaders showing up in other countries at summits, making these big commitments, but you also have corporate America making statements, whether it's the ESG pushes, the environmental social governance pushes, or their shareholders or consumers demanding it. All across the board in the corporate space, whether it's privately held or most definitely the publicly traded companies, they're making commitments. We will be carbon neutral by X. We will do this. And they're putting out reports that they're calling, their sustainability reports. And their world, and I'll talk about this in a minute, continues to change. There is potential discussion of regulation forcing those reports for the purposes of investor knowledge. So this push on agriculture, as I look at it, is kind of coming at agriculture from both that government and industry. And it can be a little overwhelming at certain points. But, again, I think agriculture is positioned in a way to be a solution. It's not without its effort, though. You are going to have to show up in the conversations through any advocacy groups that you can, and push back on ideas that you dislike, but lean into the ones that we do like. And I think we are a solution. It's not a focus of taking land out of production or taking livestock off of farms. It's really that working lands component That's cool. It's not about, ripping it out and putting everything into trees. And then the biggest issue is it's all kind of gauged in this voluntary world at this point. It's not a mandatory thing like we see in Europe or otherwise. It is voluntary, and that can come with some squishy, fuzzy details, but that is where all of these trade associations are at, from a federal level, and even Illinois Farm Bureau in my time is we are okay with it as long as it stays voluntary. So again, from the corporate standpoint, I talked about the rise of ESG and these sustainability initiatives. You've got their pledges and in the interim, and then long term, like by 2030 or by 2050, we're going to do these things. There is an estimated market, and this probably is a number that is only going to grow. An estimated market in soil carbon alone that totals about $200 billion annually. So there are people who are in corporate America that can only do so much behind their fence line, and they're going to be looking literally anywhere for offsets or programs for anything that can be done where they can help get credit for funding or coming up with these programs. And it's everywhere you look. It's the financial industry, it's regulatory, and it's investors all talking about these issues. So cool time, kind of a mess, but carbon markets are something that people keep coming back to. In the federal government, though, the thing I want to talk about is, when Biden took office, there were executive orders out literally day 2 saying, here are my commitments on climate change. And then you have this whole of government approach. And so that in my time at Farm Bureau, that's what we spent time doing, is figuring out what is USDA doing on climate smart agriculture? What is EPA going to do about any emissions or otherwise? And the conversation in DC has been about money. It has been about historic amounts of financing leaving the state government or leaving the federal government in multiple ways. It's overwhelming. I mean, you had conversations about Build Back Better, but you had money leaving the federal government in the bipartisan infrastructure package. You then had it in the Inflation Reduction Act. And then you had a little bit of action in the omnibus, just the spending plan that happened at the end of the calendar year of 2022. I spend a lot of time on different meetings representing, at first Farm Bureau and now other entities, where US EPA, for instance, is talking about the hundreds of billions of dollars that they have all in the name of climate. And they're kind of, I was kind of thinking about this on the last meeting that I had. They're like flying the plane as they're building it, just this huge outflux of money. In that case, it's all about climate. And so I think, we're only at the beginning, unfortunately or fortunately, about what these investments are really going to look like in the countryside. On the USDA side, we know that there were $3 billion of climate smart programs put out in addition to anything we're talking about here. So corporate America, partnered with academia and trade associations, and those programs will land in Illinois. Who knows if they're going to be helpful? Who knows if they're going to be anything that farmers want to sign up for? But many people are spending many billions of dollars kind of focused on climate smart ag, which could include carbon markets and maybe be like a grain premium or other ideas. And the other thing that is important is that within the NRCS world, you have about 19 billion extra dollars to those conservation programs that people already know about: CSP, EQIP, and then you'll have additional funding coming out, but lots of funding in places where it used to be more limited. So that's the backdrop. I think the other thing I wanted to mention at the federal level is the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission back on the corporate side. The big deal is that the SEC wants to come out and has proposed rules that would actually require disclosures of publicly traded companies at scope 3 emissions, which has been massively controversial for farm groups, because that's your data. That takes it all the way to the farm gate, either using models and assumptions or trying to get farm level data. And so all the farm groups, Farm Bureau included at the AFBF level primarily, and I also led the effort out of Illinois, was to push back in that comment period. But every morning, I opened my Wall Street Journal this morning, and there's stories about the SEC and rulemakings, and I'm just waiting for that final rule to be announced. So it is imminent. I mean, it would be even this fall that we find out where they landed. Okay, I will get to the point of the carbon markets now. So with all that backdrop, I think you may be wondering, why is she droning on and on about the government? Well, when Biden first took office, carbon markets were on the table as something that the federal government could have a role in. In each of those funding tranches that went out, there is also discussion of whether the federal government would have a role in this market. Many people want them to be, many people want it to be mandatory. Other people feel differently. And so in the spending package that happened at the end of the calendar year, there is this period of time here where the USDA, where the Secretary of USDA is deciding by October of this year, what role do they want to play in this market? So there is still a question mark of, does USDA step in to play some sort of role of transparency and consistency? And so it's very important that the advocacy aspects of this still be discussed and that backdrop of all of the money. But the carbon markets at this point, they were hot and heavy, and people called them the Wild West for like the last 2 years. They're still out there. And really what they are at this point is a voluntary incentive-based market that's designed to sell these ag carbon credits, either ecosystem, like, I plant cover crops that has water quality, soil health, and carbon benefits. I should get stacked payments on that, or strictly the carbon. And so in theory, a farmer who wanted to earn money could do these practices and then sell the credit to the government or the company, whatever that would look like. And a credit is a tradable asset that gives that buyer a right to offset emissions of GHG into the atmosphere. So say I'm a fertilizer manufacturer. I want to continue to manufacture fertilizer. I'm just using fertilizer as an example. It could literally be, Microsoft and their data that lets all of us be doing these Zoom meetings right now, their data centers, but they have this footprint and they want to offset that either with, changing the light bulbs, changing the trucking, changing the fuel within their own shop, or, and they do that can only get them certain amount of ways to their goals. Then they look to these credits. So obviously you have a lot of questions on what can be verified, what can be legitimate credits, and how does that all work? But in theory, one credit is equal to 1 metric ton of the CO2 emissions that are removed from the atmosphere. That ends up being 2,204 pounds of CO2. So there is, like, if you look at some of the marketing around this, there is like some, big, like inflatable dot, that like Indigo had, for instance, that said, this is what a ton of carbon looks like, because people were like, what is this that we're talking about? But there's massively needs for science in this space. I work with a scientist at U of I who, there's a lot of discussions in the scientific world about how do we verify this? How do we certify and quantify exactly what is resulting from these practices on the farm? It's all based on models at the moment. And, models, like, I don't know if you talk to like the scientific community, they're like, all models are bad, they're not perfect. And it's just like the degree of error maybe built into each model. So there could always be improved. And many people are complaining that they don't really reflect reality in this space of carbon market. So the conversations around what practices farmers can take in these carbon markets are very, very limited at the moment. And it's like just this repetition of cover crops is the main practice, no-till, reduced till, and nitrogen management. And truly, there's a lot of practices that probably can be done to reduce your carbon emissions, but those are the three most popular ones and easiest ones for companies to focus on. So that's what you end up, kind of hearing about the most. And so there is this concept that it's voluntary. It's not a regulatory like trading scheme like you would have in California, or that you would have in Europe, where it is required that these companies offset their emissions. Here, the way that we've wanted it to be as agriculture is voluntary, which then leads it to being a little bit of the Wild West. So you kind of have this trade-off. But I will say that in all of the discussions on carbon markets, the farmers that I have worked with in various capacities over the last couple of years have identified a lot of barriers to entry of the marketplace. And even academia, the farm doc folks within the University of Illinois have done at least 2 articles that I'm aware of that really do bolster what I'm about to say here. And so the farmers have identified these barriers. The first is, if I'm going to participate in this market as a farmer, I have to agree to a legal contract, and within that legal contract is some verification. And so a lot of the terms of these contracts are, people are going to ask me for my data, which I may or may not be okay with. And then they're going to use aerial imagery, and they're going to maybe even send some people out onto my farm to verify what I'm doing. Some farmers have a lot of heartburn with one or more of those things happening, and for good reason, I think, in a lot of settings. The second barrier that they've identified is additionality. For these credits to be legitimate, for the companies to not be accused of greenwashing, which means like basically making things up to look good in the eyes of a consumer, it has to be additional. That means that early adopters who've been doing cover crops, all these practices, are not going to find a place for themselves. Companies have adjusted that. They have a look back period and things, but there are still, if you've been doing cover crops for 10 years or 7 years, and you've been doing no-till for 30, you don't fit in here. And that is a problem for a lot of people who've already been doing this. The third barrier that farmers have identified is the permanence. It's not a situation where we're talking about planting trees and walking away for decades. This is a working land, and this is things that you plant and harvest on an annual basis, or may have double crop. And so it's just this concept of to be really getting the value of a credit or giving the value of a credit, you have to be committing to things for a minimum of 10 years. And that's very challenging for people to do in agriculture in that working lands scenario. The fourth barrier that's been identified is control. And largely the conversation is these programs right now, these markets that are available, don't really reflect the reality of landowner-tenant relationships and who has the control to commit that farm for 10 years and what does that look like. And then the final barriers are just financial and technological. And financial cannot be understated. A lot of the payments on these markets are smaller than they should be to accommodate the cost of taking on the practice at the farm gate, as well as your value that you would have tied into your data and your time. There is one economist that I have worked with out of Iowa State. Yep, sometimes we leave the state of Illinois. And he has done a Excel spreadsheet. I found it on LinkedIn, but it's an Excel spreadsheet that allows a farmer to go in and say, okay, here are my practices. Here's what I want to change. And boop, 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 you come up with what you could be making in a carbon market. And I had a team of farmers at the Illinois Farm Bureau that I had working on these issues, and they just put in their own data. And 9 out of 10 times a farmer was losing money in a carbon market by taking on simple practices. The only time that they would be making money is when at the same time of participating in a carbon market, they were participating in a government conservation program. So without EQIP, we're making no money, which makes you scratch your head and think, well, why would I ever engage in this carbon market in the first place? So very interesting. And my team asked him, what kind of feedback or pushback are you getting from the companies that are working on these carbon markets? And he said it was pretty significant because he had that spreadsheet out there. So the financial piece just has got to pay out a little bit higher. And there's a massive delay in the payment of a farmer taking on these practices and then harvesting the carbon and getting paid. So in some of the contracts, there's about 18 months to 2 years between that time of action and payout, and that's problematic. And then technology, if you don't have the tech on the farm at the farm level to do any of this stuff and build off of, then you're at a disadvantage. And so people are saying, you know, I don't have the equipment, I don't have the technology to pass my data on. I have to make those investments before I can enter in here. So those are the short list of barriers that have been identified. But I will say that in my opinion, it's not just farmers complaining about this doesn't work for me. It's kind of building into this advocacy of companies. If you want this to work, you really need to be thinking about these barriers. And so it's really helpful when academia or otherwise, you know, kind of picks up on the complaints that we've had at the farm gate. It's really good. So there's other complaints there. And, you know, it's data collection, it's data security, it's trust between, you know, those folks, it's the length of commitments and, you know, the legal terms. So lots of concerns there. I think as I kind of bring this to a close, the overall issues that we have now are that, you know, the main focus right now is companies just trying to grab market share here. You know, we as company X have made these commitments. We want to hustle and get a climate smart, you know, ag program with USDA. We want to start building these relationships at the farm gate, because if we're the first in time, we will capture that relationship, and then all others will be kind of put off to the side. So that's where the focus has been. But the rest of the whole world on how the carbon market would function has not yet evolved. So how are the trades going to happen? How is the verification going to happen? What are the standards by which they're operating? That is all still in flux and is not gelled yet. And that will, I think, still continue to happen, but it's not here yet. And, you know, ag is not the only game in town. These entities go to renewable energy, as you know, and they say, okay, we are, you know, making, actually, I bought school supplies for my kids, and the Crayola marker thing said these Crayola markers were made with 100% renewable energy. I thought that was fascinating. So, you know, they're finding ways to either put that at the factory or have the credentials to put that on the back of a marker box, which is just fascinating. And so ag is not the only game in town, but again, it is a potential solution, but it may be different sectors of ag or different parts of the country if we can't figure it out for Midwestern row crop and livestock farms. But there are massive challenges right now in this environment. Companies are getting a lot of pressure for potential greenwashing. And so some of them are backing away from carbon market offset conversations completely because they just see that the cost benefit is not in their favor. So like if you're reading, you know, like a Wall Street Journal or something, you'll start to kind of see that some people are backing away entirely. But all that, you know, I actually am a fairly positive person by nature. But I will say that, you know, despite all that negativity, there are still farmers that are signing up for these contracts. There are still farmers, most definitely, that are taking on these practices, maybe outside of government programs, maybe outside of any of this, but they're wanting to know kind of, how do I figure out cover crops? How do I navigate this new world? Some farmers are doing this and they're entering in, as I see it, when they've been nice enough to, you know, talk to me about what they've decided to do. They're entering into conversations and relationships with companies that they already have relationships with. So they already, you know, they're willing to kind of dip their toe in with someone that they trust, not some entity that's a startup from maybe California that might not go over as well here in the Midwest. But there are people who are dipping their toes in. if they feel like they can like kind of manage that risk and try it in a 1-year thing just to get their feel for it and get out, if they don't like it, they are doing that. And there's some folks, women and men, that I've talked to who are like, you know, we're about to do strip till anyway, or we're about to plant cover crops and we don't want to be left out if we are going to be seen as an old adopter in 2 years. So this time it makes sense for us and our farm to give it a shot. So, and I've had guys, mainly guys, call me and say, Lauren, I'm sorry, but I ended up signing, like they're apologizing to me for signing up for these carbon markets. I'm like, I'm not mad at you. I'm just telling you, you need to go in eyes wide open and make sure you ask these questions and be diligent about what you're looking at. So, but there are a number of farmers, as I have understood it, that are not interested. And I think, you know, sometimes there's a lot of other discussions that happen all around. One of them, as I see, is, you know, there's kind of limited capacity for some folks who are already feeling very inundated by renewable energy projects and lawyers and legal contracts and all of that, that they just don't have the capacity to take on another avenue of risk. And there's a little bit of mistrust there. There also is this historic amount of conservation funding. And so if people if they're even inclined to go to the USDA offices, they're probably going to get funding this time around for a lot of these things. And then they don't have to worry about this effort over here. And so yeah, I think, you know, there's a lot that kind of builds where people are just going to maybe kind of wait and see. So I'll stop there and see if y'all have any just reaction or questions in general, but I appreciate you listening here. I do think this issue is still going to be very prevalent. It's still going to be part of the conversation that will inevitably happen in a bipartisan fashion as we keep talking about the next farm bill. And so it's not going away. The programs, when you open your mailbox or you open your email inbox, you're still going to get inundated with these proposals and programs and things like that. So I'm here. I could talk to you about it, but I'll stop now and see what reactions or questions or thoughts that you have from what we covered today.
Ruth, you had a comment in the chat. I didn't know if you wanted to unmute yourself and actually ask your question.
Yeah, hi, Lauren. I thought John Kerry was on the, the Talking Heads program, spouting how agriculture was responsible for a full third of carbon emissions in the world. You said 10% in America. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes, and he is like the climate envoy. So he is that external, whether we like it or not, he is the external facing arm of this climate initiative out of the Biden administration. So he's the one going to all the global summits, and he is talking about global ag emissions when he spouts that number, which is probably true when you think about all, globally. But in the US, where we go to, where everyone really goes to, is this EPA emissions inventory. And that puts it, US agriculture is different than agriculture in other countries. And so we kind of keep that conversation coming back to us, to our track record, and to where we fit in our world. But yes, he is part of that Talking Heads, as you said.
Yeah. Thank you.
You bet. I will say that there was, and my days are running together, but I think about a month ago, there was an initiative, there was an acronym for it, but like a summit in DC where a lot of these folks, like John Kerry, were there. And it was all about carbon, all about climate, and with regard to agriculture. And so some of the academics that I know from, frankly, the University of Illinois were in that room, and they're like, this is not, this is not the conversation that we need to be having. And they raised their hand. This is why we worked hard at the Farm Bureau to have good relationships with academics, because they're the guys and ladies that are invited into these rooms. They raised their hand and they said, where are the farmers in this meeting where you're talking about the, I'm like, thank you for doing that. So he just, they insert a little bit of like farmer perspective in those meetings, but that is supposed to be basically a precursor to some of the national or international meetings that will continue to happen.
Okay, and my one last comment to make, Southern Illinois Carbondale is doing some research with carbon sequestration. I don't know if you've heard anything about it. I just heard a tip of an iceberg on it.
Oh, Carbondale?
SIU,
Yeah.
Southern Illinois University. I think it's at Carbondale. I think that's where the
Okay.
professor is.
Okay. I am familiar with a lot of their work down there, but I'm not familiar with their carbon side of things, water quality, agronomy, all the other
Yeah,
things.
he's in that group. And
Okay.
oh golly, it kind of intrigued me because it was a concept of, how we recycle waste. Everybody kind of throws their recyclables in a location that's been put out to do that, and then someone comes and takes and recycled it. Well, they're doing the same thing for agriculture, where we can, some farmers recycle this, or we can capture the carbon and then pump it deep into the ground to sequester it. So
Okay.
it's like we're the gathering point. Farmers are the gathering point, and then this industry is going to come along and figure out how to take our gathering point and take that converted carbon and sequester it in the ground. I'm just throwing that out there. Like I said, I don't know a lot about it, but it sounded intriguing to me. It was a different approach, not one of, hey, I'm going to pay you to borrow some of your carbon credits so I can fly across the ocean. I'm sorry, ladies, if I offend anybody on the call here. That is just so bumpus to me that you think you can buy your way out of it and think you're okay. Just
so you would be in the camp of greenwashing. That's what we call.
Is that what greenwashing is?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm a greenwasher.
And that's where a lot of people, and I spent the last 2 years doing presentations to groups of farmers about everything I just talked about. And my favorite, there's a philosophical difference, between people, and many of the farmers, just like you, that I talked to were like, I don't think this makes any sense. And I don't think the general public is going to buy it in the long run. And I don't want to be wrapped up in something that is not going to be well received by the public. And that is them like having these like, sort of feelings that this is not going to go over well. And then my favorite quote, this one guy, I forget what county it was, but he said, "What are we talking about here? This feels like fairy dust. We can't see it, we can't measure it, we can't touch it, but we just need to do the practices, and someone is going to tell me what it's worth."
Yeah.
I was like, yes. But on the carbon sequestration, I guess the difference that I'm talking about here in any of the carbon markets is we're talking about soil carbon.
Mhm.
We're talking about at the very surface and what you can do to like build soil health, the organic matter, and how that translates into carbon. But the rest of the conversation that happens is all about carbon sequestration, which is we have geology in the state to pump that. And there are other, I didn't know about Carbondale, but there is a big group out of the Prairie Research Institute out of Champaign that has been studying it in the Decatur area around ADM for 10 years. And that's why the conversations are happening in Illinois, because we have the geology to sink it. And then people say, from a policy standpoint, that's your ability to keep ethanol relevant. That's your ability to keep that fertilizer manufacturing. But in the farm community, the pipelines are the incredibly controversial thing throughout the Midwest. So yeah, you can sink it in the geology. That's probably like scientifically valid, but then you have the people and the political aspect of the pipelines taking it all across the world to Illinois. And that's where former colleagues of mine at the Farm Bureau spent, unfortunately, a lot of time on that issue, and still will, I think, in the next General Assembly session.
Did you just tell me people think they're going to put this stuff in a pipeline? And
They'll-
we're
yeah.
going to take care of it here in Illinois? Really?
Yes, yes,
There's people who believe that.
yes. Not, well, CO2. Yes.
CO2, yes. What we breathe, most of the atmosphere, blah, blah.
Well, let's talk to our resident engineer on the line, because I'm not an engineer, but yeah, they turn it into some form that can be in the pipeline. But
Oh,
yes.
cow, okay.
Yeah, they pressurize it, put it in the pipeline, they bring it here, and then they basically have they think they're using the soil and the ground to take that and hold the CO2 and not treat it, but they're sequestering it into
The
Sequester.
geology. And we're talking deep down in our geology.
Yeah.
Just a quick comment. Hopefully you're able to hear me. I have an owner in the Polo area who I used to manage for, and they are investigating because several years ago, they were approached to be one of the farms where it was sequestered and would come in by pipeline. So they have been approached in the past. I don't know how many years ago it was, but they're now wanting to investigate and see if they are still available.
Yeah.
Tammy, you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Gail. First of all, Lauren, thanks for the presentation. This is fantastic. You got us a lot of information, which I'm sure you were thinking, how do I get all this in the time frame they're giving me? But I did want to share, I actually heard it on WGN radio, I think 2 weeks ago. And I remember thinking that this coalition's name is too long. I'll never remember it. And obviously I should have written it down because they're not catchy enough with it. But it was a lady that was against the CO2 pipelines and I forget the company's name, but they have a proposal. They're requesting to get the pipeline in, actually to fruition. So I apologize. I didn't think about doing the research ahead of time, but back to I guess validate your points and to confirm to Ruth that yes, actually, and there's companies that are putting proposals out there to actually get the pipelines through Illinois.
Yeah. So I just read an article yesterday that the Iowa, this is AgriPulse, but Iowa Farm Bureau and the Sierra Club in Iowa are actually on the same side of the issue on the pipelines. So that never happens, if that tells you. I mean, you just have a lot of issues. Now within the Illinois Farm Bureau, it's a member dividing issue. If you have it coming in, it is, people are passionate on both sides. If it's coming through their property, they're very concerned about safety. So we had policy from our annual meeting last year. And I do think that conversation is going to evolve. And there were, the Illinois Farm Bureau was actively engaged in the legislative session because you had 16 bills around that, the pipeline specifically. So, and that Prairie Research Institute did a big, report and did a task force and all these things with regard to the science. So it's a massive issue, but it's not just Illinois. It is the entire Midwest. We just have the geology that is incredibly favorable in the central part of the state where it's gonna maybe be coming here,
I got a dumb question to ask then. People who oppose the pipeline. Okay, it's one thing to have, natural gas underground blowing up or oil underground, polluting water table. CO2, what we breathe out. What's the danger there of putting it through a pipeline? Not that I'm in favor of pipelines, don't get me wrong, but just that can't be an objection to the thing, can it?
There are safety issues, and I'm not the expert on that, but there's one incident that happened down in, I think it was Louisiana, a southern state, where that is the poster child for what could go wrong. And every policy conversation comes back to, maybe it's Mississippi, but they keep coming back to that. So there are, I think it's to Gail's point of the pressurization of it. It can be a problem, but they're also regulated in their construction and in their operation by federal government.
Yeah.
So that was actually where the Farm Bureau policy got to last year, is we support them as long as they follow the safety standards. So, but yes, you would have issues. It ends up being more of a private property argument for
Okay.
farmers and getting compensated, and eminent domain versus abilities to interject. I will say too, this is this carbon sequestration, that's part of the Inflation Reduction Act that is being and other pieces of legislation that's just being incentivized with tax credits. That's why these companies want to be doing that. But like an ADM, for instance, they've got multiple angles of a play in their sustainability. So it's going to be this carbon sequestration, but it's also these like regenerative ag kind of programs and things. So it's all of the above for certain companies. So I think it's just kind of got to keep that in mind. They are different issues, but depending on the company, they could be looking at multiple plays at the same time to see how they're going to meet commitments that they've made on the global, like ADM is global. They're making these statements and they're sending reports out to many people. The other concept that's tied in here, and I was in Minnesota earlier this week on meetings talking about this. The other very fascinating thing here, and I know we're running low on time, is you had mentioned, Ruth, the flights and the planes. The airline industries are incredibly pressured to lower their, transportation is massive, right? You can't put a battery on a plane like you can an EV in a car. So they have to be thinking about their fuels. And there's conversations about sustainable aviation fuel. And now you have basically big oil and big ag and venture capital all looking at what the heck do we burn and what the heck can we turn into fuel to make it jet fuel to fuel our planes in the future. And so this meeting that I was at the last couple of days, it's this long effort of pennycress, basically. So taking pennycress, modifying it in, with plant geneticists and turning it into a higher value oil. It's a long play. It's a new crop that they'd have to get through the pipeline. But these airlines are also making the commitments, and they are literally interested in any technology that can change their fuel and bring down their emissions. So I think it's kind of cool. Now, whether it's pennycress, I don't know if it's going to be pennycress. It's going to be lots of things, but soybeans and corn are going to factor into jet fuel in the future. And it's like, you got to move from, I think 18 million gallons is what they have now, and their demand is 30 billion in like 10 years. So you have a lot of innovation that will happen just to be thinking about fuels a lot differently.
So by the way, here's where the pennycress is going to
Yes.
push their market, and you can see why we're heavily into it. So,
Yeah. So one of my clients is Covercress.
Yeah, it's Covercress. Yeah, that's the company here.
That's cool.
So,
well, that's the meeting that I was just at, where I felt like the dumbest person in the room because all these younger people are like plant geneticists. I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But they need help with the federal government, just getting decisions made. Yep. So, and yes, Western WindFippen is the lead on that project that I was at. And then ISU, I'm here in Bloomington, Illinois. So ISU folks are involved, and we were in Minnesota because they have partnerships with the University of Minnesota, and they also have them in Iowa too. But Covercress is based out of St. Louis. Very cool. Lots to talk about in this space, really. But.
Yeah, and one last point on anybody hear about the ADM Regenerative Ag Program? Anybody participating in that? Just curious. I found that to be kind of an interesting program. They're going to actually pay farmers to do their checklist of things, and then ADM is going to market their products based on, say, see, we gather from people who produce responsibly. And I didn't know if anybody's participating or if anybody's been approached on it here on the line. With it being ADM there in Decatur, I thought for sure that maybe there'd be one or two that I don't personally know of anybody who's participating in it yet, but just curious.
Ruth, where are you located?
I'm down by St. Louis,
Okay.
60 miles east of St. Louis.
Where's that? What
My
town?
Mount Vernon and
Mount Vernon.
Centralia would be the big towns next to me.
Okay. I grew up in Marion. That's why I asked.
Oh, there you go. You're all welcome.
I'm
gal.
familiar.
Yeah.
Yeah, very cool.
Any last thoughts or questions for Lauren?
Well, I'm going to type my email in here. I'm in between setting up like a legitimate website and things. So I'm using my Gmail for now. And then here's my cell phone. I'm going to put this in here. You guys, you ladies can call or email with other questions. Like I said, well, I didn't say this, but I loved my time working for the Illinois Farm Bureau. I really did. I love the people that I worked for. I love the issues. I'll still be relevant in these issues, just with different clients. But I approach these issues from, I mean, I did not grow up on a farm, but I feel like I understand the sentiment and the feelings of the farmers that I represented. So when I'm in these groups, that's what I'm doing. And my intention is to continue to do that with new clients and still be helpful at the farm gate. It just may look a little different than it has for the last 10 years. So, but yeah, I think these issues, unfortunately or fortunately, are not going away for agriculture in Illinois. And it's my feeling that getting involved, whatever that looks like, I'm not saying people need to sign up, like rush and sign up for these programs, but advocating and speaking up for what you like and what you don't like in some organized fashion, it's critical, because people are saying that agriculture is like the next frontier on all of these programs and the tech and the investment. And so agriculture in theory could look very different in the next 10 years. And we could either help shape it, or other people are going to shape it and we're not going to like it. So that's kind of my feeling, is that we just need to still be involved in its industry. Has a lot of government money these days, and that's not going to dry up with a new president in the White House. That's money that's out there. And so it's going to be like this increasingly, in my view, interwoven between government and industry from a lot of different angles. Fuels, carbon, the market premiums, I think, are really enticing. It may be less of a carbon market conversation, more of a premium on the grain upon delivery for certain practices. And then the fuel side, I think, is something that we have to pay attention to.
Well, if the government is looking for a place to cut its $30 trillion debt, I have a suggestion for them. I'll just leave it at that.
Understood. I appreciate you ladies having me. I'm always happy to come back if you need me. Otherwise, thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you, Lauren.
And we'll have this up on our YouTube channel. So you can feel free to share that on your LinkedIn or wherever you'd like to. So anyway, thank you guys so much for joining our coffee chat. Thank you, Lauren. And we will see you next month for Jennifer Scheich. She's going to be talking about pork and all things pork related. So
Very cool.
guys, have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Everybody.
See you.